Hello, guys. So, in this lecture, I will give you an overview of part 4 of Everything's an Argument, which you're reading this week. And so far in the class, you have analyzed and critiqued some arguments that are written. We've talked about ways to analyze various types of arguments. We've talked about what to call those types of arguments. This week, we'll talk about style and presentation in arguments. So chapter 13 deals with the styles of written arguments. The big takeaway from this chapter, I think, is just to consider your audience. So think about who you're writing for, think about what purpose you're writing for, and then make linguistic choices or language choices that make sense given who you're writing for. And this might be something you already do. It honestly took me a while to consider this really and to always kind of make sure that I had it in mind. Whether you're writing for a class, whether you're writing a text message, whether you're writing an email, who you're writing the email to if you're writing one, the purpose and the type of thing that you're writing matters, but also who you're writing for matters. So some things that this chapter asks you to consider that might affect the style of your argument, or that do affect the style of your argument, include word choice, sentence structure, punctuation, types of figurative language. There's a whole bunch of stuff in this chapter about various types of figurative language. A lot of time is spent on various types of figurative language. Figurative language is essentially just a type of language that turns one thing into another thing, so it creates what we call representation. And so figurative language is a way to represent something. For example, a common type of figurative language is metaphor. And a simple example of a metaphor would be if I said something like, my love is a rose. And so I'm representing my love for somebody as being a rose that like blossoms and is beautiful for a while, but also has thorns and eventually like gets old and ugly and dies or whatever, or can be put into a decorative wreath. Now I'm just being silly. But the point is, this is a type of language that turns my love into something else, a rose. And in doing so, it represents it in a particular way and draws people's attention to certain aspects of this love that I have for somebody, evidently. So this chapter goes over all of these different types of figurative language. It goes over metaphor, but also a bunch of different other types of figurative language as well. And the last thing that this chapter covers really briefly in a box on the last page of the chapter is levels of formality. And this actually arguably maybe could have been expanded or should have had more time devoted to it in the chapter. Essentially what's being talked about here is register. And so this also might go without saying, but depending on who you're talking to or who you're writing for, the type of formality or the level of formality in your writing will change. So to put it into plain language, it might, if you're writing a text message to your best friend, you won't be as formal as if you're writing an essay for a college class. And if you're writing an essay for a college class and it does sound like a text message to your best friend, you're probably doing something wrong. So it's important to consider what context you're writing in, who you're writing for, and how that might impact the style choices that you make. And there's a lot more that you can read about this stuff in chapter 13, but that's basically what you'll read about in chapter 13. That's what's in there. Chapter 14 is about visual rhetoric. And this is particularly important to us in this class because your second essay will focus on analyzing a piece of visual rhetoric. It will focus on analyzing a visual argument. And so chapter 14 goes over ways that visual rhetoric can be used. An image can be added to a spoken argument or a written argument, or it can be the argument itself. Like this image over here on the right is one I just pulled off the internet a couple hours ago. I was trying to find an example of a visual argument, and all the ones I was finding were ones that were going to like make everybody cry or make me cry when I tried to talk about them, or they were so disturbing I could barely look at them. For some reason, maybe I was going to the wrong place to try to find a cool visual argument. But I thought this one was kind of interesting. The argument it makes maybe is up for debate, but it seems like it might be saying something about how attached we are to our screens, even when we're in a place where there's natural splendor and beauty and wonder all around us, such as in a museum. Well, I guess not natural splendor and beauty and wonder, but splendor and beauty and wonder that's man-made. We're still attached to our phones or glued to our phones when we could be looking at all this cool stuff and discussing it with other people. So what the specific argument is, you guys can think about, but there's some kind of an argument being presented here, and the way that the image is tailored and the way that it's been altered helps to persuade the audience that the argument that's being made is one worth considering. So just like written arguments or spoken arguments can contain, often contain rhetoric, they contain logos, pathos, and ethos to persuade us that what they're saying is true. Images that make arguments also contain perhaps logos, pathos, and ethos, or lack them if they're not doing a very good job, but they contain logos, pathos, and ethos in order to persuade us that what they're saying is true, or what the perspective that they're presenting is worth considering. So anyway, this chapter contains all kinds of interesting things to consider when analyzing a visual argument. Chapter 15 is not directly relevant to our class. I want to be upfront about that. It's about making a presentation in class. Specifically, it's about making a presentation that presents an argument. We're not going to be doing that in this class. It's an online class. It's not really the focus of the class anyway, like getting up in front of the class and presenting something. I don't really have students do that in the on-campus version of this class anyway. However, I thought this chapter might be worth reading just because you're probably going to have to present things in other classes. You'll likely be making presentations in college at some point if you haven't done so already. And if you're not taking a speech class, this chapter might help you to make better presentations, but it won't directly relate to our class. Chapter 16 is about multimedia arguments. So to me, this chapter seems like a catch-all chapter just for internet sources, basically, such as websites, videos, wikis, blogs, and social media. The beginning of the chapter draws a distinction between old media and new media, and how arguments presented via these different types of media might differ. There are ways to analyze new media arguments that are presented in this chapter. There are questions that the chapter asks you to consider when analyzing so-called new media arguments. Basically, new media here just meaning all of those internet sources listed in bullet point 1 right there. So websites, videos, wikis, blogs, and social media. The things that the book wants you to consider when analyzing multimedia arguments include who created this argument, why is it being presented, how does the medium affect the way that it's presented, who's the intended audience, what is the purpose of this thing basically, and how has it been designed to make a point. So consider where it's coming from and consider who it's intended for are two things to always keep in mind. Then the chapter transitions to talking about making arguments via these various types of media, which we won't be doing in the class. I guess you're making an argument via a type of new media in that you're making an argument and posting it in an online class, but you're not like creating a blog, for instance, or creating a video. You're creating essays in this class that are written. But you will be analyzing multimedia arguments in this class, and you have already actually to a certain extent in the discussions. So anyway, I hope this chapter and the rest of part 4